Once upon a time in a community, there lived a girl called Jane. Jane was 15 years old and was the eldest and only daughter of her parents, Mrs. N.K. and Mr. James. Mr. James was a trader. He was neither rich nor poor, but he was comfortable enough to take care of his family. Mrs. N.K. was a caterer who made cakes and other snacks for occasions or even when called upon. They lived in a small bungalow they built near downtown. Jane was an intelligent girl who aced all her results from junior secondary to senior secondary school. She wrote her WAEC at the age of 15 years and passed all her exams. She became one of the youngest graduates from her school, and that was due to her brilliance and hard work in reading. Jane applied for JAMB and post-UTME just as she came out of secondary school. She took her JAMB and scored a very good grade, then went to the university level for UTME and scored very well. She had always wanted to be a doctor, so she applied for medicine and surgery. She was given admission into the university she applied to. She was very happy, and her parents too. Mr. James was overwhelmed with joy that his daughter was making them proud, and Mrs. N.K. was also happy. However, she felt like everything was moving too fast for her daughter, that her daughter couldn't yet see past herself. It was her mother's intuition. Mrs. N.K. knew how wayward university life could be, students and people doing a lot of bad things and other stuff. But she didn't want that for her daughter, because she was very young and could be easily influenced by her course mates. Mrs. N.K. thought of telling her daughter to calm down at least until she turned 17 or 18 before applying to the university, as it was really a challenging place for her at that age. One day, Mrs. N.K. called her daughter Jane and sat her down. "Jane, you know I really love you, my daughter, and I know that every action and everything I do is only to shield and protect you, even if you don't see it that way. It's the job of parents to do that. Please, university is a place of deceit and not for someone of your age. You know I was against you going to university now, so please, my daughter, withdraw the admission and wait till you are 17 or 18, Mrs. N.K. said with a concerned expression. Jane frowned at her mother's words. "No, Mom, I can't do that. Almost all my friends have gotten admission already, and you want me to stay at home for like 2 years? No, Mom, I won't do that," she replied, refusing to back down. "You see, here comes your friends again, and how well do you think you know them? You know I'm doing this for you. Besides, all your friends are a year or two older than you too. Trust me, you are not prepared for what is out there yet, because it will come as a rush to you," her mother said. But all her words meant nothing to Jane, as she was eager and wanted to go to school. Mrs. N.K. didn't see any other way she could convince her daughter to stay home until she was at least 17. When Mr. James came back from work, Jane sat with her father and told him everything her mother had said. James actually saw the sense in it, but ignored it, since he always wanted the best for his daughter. During the night in bed, Mrs. N.K. brought up the issue to her husband. "Don't you think it is too early to send Jane to university at age 15? Please, let's reconsider this. You know your daughter can easily be swayed and influenced because she's still a child," Mrs. N.K. said with concern. James discarded in a single thought what his wife was trying to make him understand. "Come on, let the girl be, okay? Besides, she's going to be 16 soon, so don't worry about her. She can take care of herself. We'll try to take care of her as her parents. So don't overthink it too much. Let this go," James replied. Mrs. N.K. was not okay with sending her daughter to school, as her heart kept warning her. But she understood that she didn't want to hold her back either. So instead, she let the thought go. After the semester resumed for a new session, Jane's parents prepared her the best they could, getting all the things she would need to live on campus. On the day she was leaving, Jane was overwhelmed with joy that she had become a university student at her age. She was excited and full of pride. Her parents sat her down and had a talk with her. "Jane, well, since you both voted me out for you to stay at least even if it's just a year, I have accepted the fact, and I am happy for you, Jane. My only advice is, don't forget the teachings we have given you here. Read your books and don't join bad friends, please. University is just like a drug. If you get sucked into the reckless lifestyle there, it's very hard to let go. So please, make us proud," her mother said, full of concern, but also happy that her daughter was growing. Her father also encouraged her to make them proud and not do anything stupid. After their conversation, Mr. James drove Jane to the school campus. On entering the state, Jane was moved by her surroundings, the beauty of the streets and the lights everywhere. She was excited. A few minutes later, they arrived at the campus. Jane lived in the school hostel with her 2 childhood friends who had also gained admission to the same school. They saw Jane arrive and were very excited to see her, calling themselves campus girls as they were happy and excited. Jane arranged her things in the hostel room she shared with her friends. After that, Mr. James gave his daughter a very big hug, made sure she was all right, and then he left. Jane began her registration and the necessary things needed to get started with education in the institution. She started lectures, too, in medicine and surgery. 2 of her friends, Tessa and Olive, were in other departments. Tessa was in the biochemistry department, while Olive was in biology. They all had the same mindset to study organism and body-related courses, and they got what they wanted. Tessa was much of a girl who liked partying and living recklessly sometimes, and now being alone in school gave her all the time she needed to do the same, since it was a free world to roam around the campus. One day, Jane, on her way to the department, met a guy who approached her. "Hey girl, how are you doing?" he said. "I am fine, thanks for asking," Jane replied, full of pride. "I am Daniel by name. We are from the same department, and I saw you the other day in class. You seem to be a very intelligent girl, so that's why I approached you. I thought we could be friends," he said. Jane was all full of herself as she turned Daniel down and left. Jane was serious about her studies and decided not to make any new friends, instead sticking with her old ones. After the first semester exams, all results came out, and Jane aced all her papers. She became one of the top students with a high CGPA in her class. Jane's parents were proud of her when she sent her results back home. Tessa and Olive also made very good grades as they aced theirs too. They continued to read more and more to maintain good grades in their first year. The next year, they entered their second year. They were happy that they were advancing in levels. One day, Tessa thought, "Now that I have good grades, I should enjoy myself a little bit, like go dancing with a handsome guy, go to parties, and all that. It won't affect my grades," she thought to herself. But she felt she had to leave the hostel, since it was becoming too boring for her. As she was sitting with Olive and Jane, she brought up the conversation. "Hey girls, I think it's time we left the hostel and found a good lodge outside campus, just the 3 of us. What do you think?" Tessa said. Olive thought it was a good idea too, but Jane didn't agree because her parents wouldn't allow it. "I don't think this is a good idea, and besides, my parents won't allow it, so I am not in for it, please," Jane said as she turned the offer down. "Then don't tell them. They don't need to know everything you do in this school. Come on, girl. We are big girls on campus, remember? So let's make our own path." "I don't like this hostel anymore," Olive said, convincing Jane. After some persuasion, Jane agreed to leave the hostel and go off campus. Jane felt a little restless. Her heart beat faster about the decision she made, but she thought, "What do you know? This is my life." The following week, Jane, Tessa, and Olive moved out of the school hostel and rented an apartment off campus that was big enough to accommodate the 3 of them. Their parents didn't know they had done such a thing, as they kept it a secret from them. Jane's mother or father would call, and Jane would keep it together so that they wouldn't know something was wrong, and so did Tessa and Olive. The 3 girls now had the full opportunity and chance to live as they chose, as the school hostel never gave them much of a choice due to too many rules. Tessa started going to parties as she was assisted by Olive. Jane refused to go many times until one day she couldn't. One day, the 3 girls prepared for a party that night and left. They got to the club where they enjoyed themselves, dancing with the crowd and drinking alcohol. Tessa had a boyfriend. His name was Bernard, but he was called Iceman, as it was his nickname and what he was known as on campus. He was a guy with a lot of connections in underground stuff and looked much like a bad guy. After the dance, they sat by the corner at the nightclub. Tessa sat with her boyfriend as they talked and laughed together. Bernard brought out a cigarette and lit it up as he started smoking. He gave Tessa one too. By the corner, Jane watched. "Come on, why the cigarette? You know we shouldn't be doing this, Jane said. Olive, on the other hand, took one for herself and turned to Jane. Come on, girl, this is school, so enjoy yourself. After all, this isn't harmful and it won't cost you anything to give it a try. So, come on, Olive said. Jane listened to her friends, took one too, and tapped. Jane felt good and more satisfied than she ever had since she came to school. Jane enjoyed herself, even to the point she lost track of time. The next day, she woke up on her bed in the apartment, surprised and confused about how she got there. What happened to me? She asked Olive, sitting by the corner of the bed. Girl, you were a beast yesterday. I have never seen you this happy before, and trust me, you really enjoyed yourself. Me and Tessa took you home because you were high. So don't worry, you are okay, we got you, Olive replied. Jane couldn't believe what she did. The fact that she took alcohol and cigarettes was what terrified her. She had never done that before in her entire life. But for a moment, it felt good. As days went by, Jane's friends started partying too much, including her as well, bringing friends and boyfriends into their apartment. Most of the time, Jane went with them, but sometimes she didn't. Instead, Tessa and Olive brought the party to the apartment. Jane was not much of a person, quite fond of people around, but with the parties she started to get sucked into it all. Until one day she met a guy, one of Bernard's colleagues, Adrian. Jane started to like Adrian after a long conversation. Adrian was a fun guy to be with. He made Jane laugh with his bad guy vibes, but he was a really bad influence on Jane. He was a drug addict and not good for Jane. After months passed, Jane fell in love with Adrian. They were together most of the time. Jane knew he wasn't good with his grades and didn't read, but she tried to make him study because of her love for him. Back at home, Mrs. N.K. was always concerned about her daughter Jane and how she was doing in school. One night, as she lay awake deep in thought, James, her husband, tapped her. "What's wrong, dear?" he asked in concern. "I am just thinking about Jane, our daughter. It's been months since I have seen her, so I am just really worried about how she is doing in school now that she's going to her 3rd year," she replied, worried. James was not bothered at all with the expression on his face. "Come on, dear. Jane is 18 now. Quit the worry and trust that your daughter can take care of herself. And besides, we call her on the phone all the time, don't we?" James said as he went back to sleep. Mrs. N.K., after her conversation with her husband, decided to calm down and went to bed. It was Adrian's birthday. He invited Jane, Tessa, Olive, and all his friends and crew. They partied all night, played some sort of games, and this was where it all got complicated. Adrian brought out cigarettes. As he and his friends started lighting up, Tessa and Olive took 2. Adrian and Jane were sitting together. "Come on, have some. It feels good inside," Adrian said. Jane felt guilty, as she thought this might be taking it too far, but she decided to do it. Jane took and lighted hers. At that moment, Jane was high instantly because not only did she took cigarette, but she also consumed some alcohol too. She was not herself again. She left the party and went home with Olive. The next day, she was a little disoriented, but she tried to keep it together because she needed to attend her classes for the day. In the classroom, she wore sunglasses to cover her eyes. After the class, she was called by her lecturer to her office. She came in and sat down. "Are you okay, Jane?" Mrs. Helen asked. "I am fine, Ma. Just a little disoriented," she replied. "Okay, if so, the reason why I called you over is that your grades are now down by 66% this semester, and you have never gotten below this before. This might make you not qualify for the internship assessment level, so please up your grades and remove any distractions this period," Mrs. Helen advised her. Jane left her office and went back to her room. She sat on her bed and thought about what Mrs. Helen told her. She decided to try her best, as her recent behavior had started to mess up her grades. At times, she didn't come to class at all or even bother to read. One day, Jane sat at the table in her room as she went through her books. A call came in, and it was her mom. "Hello, Mom. How are you doing?" she asked. "I am fine, my daughter," she said. "And you too. How are you doing, and how are your studies going?" Mrs. N.K. asked. "It is going well, Mom. I am doing great," Jane said, trying to hide her thoughts from her mom. Mrs. N.K. couldn't tell if her daughter was honest with her or not. "Jane, I hope all is okay. You know I am here for you anytime," she said, trying to see if her daughter would open up to her. "Mom, please don't worry yourself. I am fine. Okay, Jane replied. As they ended the call, Jane hung up and went back to her reading. A few minutes later, she received a call from Adrian, who asked her to come to his lodge so they could study together. Jane saw it as a bad idea and a distraction, but she ignored all the warnings and went to Adrian's apartment without a second thought. Both sat and studied together. In a few moments, Adrian started to look at Jane and touched her waist. "Adrian, please, you need to stop. Can't you see we are reading?" she said. Jane resisted and refused all Adrian's advances. Adrian, determined to make Jane comply, smiled and excused himself to go buy drinks for both of them. Adrian drugged Jane's drink and brought it to her. Jane drank it, unaware that the drink was drugged. In a few minutes, she started to feel strange and developed a weird sense of wanting to be touched, as she was already high. Adrian got his chance and had his way with Jane. Some hours later, Jane woke up and saw herself entirely undressed. She was shocked and thought to herself, "What have I done?" Beside her lay Adrian. She woke him up. "What have you done to me?" She angrily asked him. "Relax, babe, it was fun. You really enjoyed it, you know," he replied without flinching. The whole world seemed to collapse on Jane as she realized she had been violated. "How could you do this to me?" "You raped me, Adrian," she said in tears. Jane didn't know what to do, but the only explanation she could think of was that she had been drugged. She picked up the drinking cup, smelled it, and realized Adrian had drugged her. She broke up with Adrian and left. Adrian showed no remorse for what he had done because he had just deflowered Jane. Jane went back to her apartment, crying heavily. Tessa and Olive came back and saw her crying. "Hey, Jane, why are you crying?" Tessa asked. Jane narrated everything that happened. Tessa was angry at what Adrian did. She went out while Olive stayed back to look after Jane. Tessa confronted Adrian and gave him a piece of her mind. "Let nothing happen to my friend, because if it does, I will hold you responsible," she said and left. 2 weeks later, Jane was in a lab with other students conducting some experiments. Jane was not feeling well as she was sweating profusely. Her coursemate, Deborah, asked her, "Are you all right, Jane?" "Yes, I am. Just a little headache, that's all," she replied. Deborah persuaded her to take permission to go and rest. Jane did that and went to her apartment. On getting to the door, Jane fell unconscious. Olive opened the door, saw Jane on the ground, and called Tessa. They rushed Jane to the hospital. After some time, the doctor broke the news to Jane. "You are 2 weeks pregnant," the doctor said. Jane cried the entire night after leaving the office. Tessa and Olive consoled her. She cursed the day she met Adrian, knowing he was responsible for the pregnancy. Adrian denied the pregnancy. Jane couldn't take it anymore, and out of fear, she told Tessa to help her get pills to abort the baby. Tessa and Olive advised her against it, but Jane felt she had no choice. She believed she couldn't continue her studies with the pregnancy, and her parents would disown her. Jane bought the pills and took them to terminate the pregnancy. A few days after completing the dose, Jane fell very sick and was taken to the hospital. It was very serious. Tessa and Olive decided to involve her parents. The next morning, Tessa called Jane's mother and broke the news to her. Mrs. N.K. was shocked that her daughter was in the hospital. She called her husband, and both headed to the school to see their daughter. On getting to the hospital, the doctor called Jane's parents into her office. After they sat down, the doctor said, "This might come as a shock to you, but I have to say it. Your daughter is 2 weeks pregnant. I believe she tried to abort the baby by taking pills, which almost killed her. Thankfully, we were able to flush it out of her system, but the pregnancy still remains." Mrs. N.K., in tears, cried because she had foreseen this coming, and now it was too late. Mr. James blamed himself, even though he had seen the warning signs his wife kept mentioning before. Jane was taken home and treated properly. Jane was ashamed of herself for what she had done. She didn't know how she would be able to face her parents, feeling like the disgrace she was. The next day, as her parents sat in the parlor, Jane, in tears, knelt down in front of them. "I am sorry, Mom. I am sorry, Dad." "It was a mistake," she pleaded. Her angry mother stood and approached Jane to beat her, but she was held back by James, her husband. "I warned you. I told you countless times that you were not ready for university life, and now my greatest fear has happened. You even rented an apartment off campus without our knowledge and consent." Mrs. N.K. said, boiling with anger. Mr. James was ashamed of his daughter and also of himself for not listening to his wife. But he was also entirely mad that Jane had tried to abort the baby, which was against their religion. Still, he was merciful enough to live with the consequences. Jane started a new phase of life as she stayed home to take care of the pregnancy. Her mother, Mrs. N.K., never forgave her daughter, even though they were living in the same house and under the same roof for months. 9 months later, Jane gave birth to a son. 2 years later, she was lucky enough to go back to school, this time wiser. She finished her remaining years and graduated. Tessa and Olive never saw Jane again after the incident, as they both learned from her mistake and focused on their books. They graduated. Tessa flew abroad for her master's, and Olive relocated with her parents. Jane found it hard to be a single mother while looking for a job. Doing both was a lot harder on her, especially as her mother never talked to her. Jane tried her best to get through to her mother, N.K., but she was not in the mood to reconcile. This was not the future she had dreamt of for her only child, to have a child outside marriage, and to be denied by the father of the child. Adrian, who had dropped out of school, flew away and was never seen again. Mr. James felt pity for his daughter and how she had been neglected by her mother. He tried his best to make N.K. come around. Eventually, she did. N.K. never hated her daughter. It was just that Jane had never listened to her, and now she had made a big mistake. The lesson was that Jane now understood the concept of motherhood. N.K. forgave her daughter Jane over a dinner. Jane was happy that her mother, after over 3 years, had finally forgiven and accepted her for her mistakes. They reconciled, and life moved on as Jane found peace in her life once more. Dear viewers, what do you think about this story? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, give us a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and share it with friends. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest updates. Thanks, and see you in the next video. Bye!